Welcome to the Our World Heritage 2021 debate. 2021 debate is a year of events focused on protection, conservation, and management of World Heritage. We want to uncover untold stories to broaden our views on heritage practices and future perspectives. Knowledge gathered this year will be published in 2022 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Convention. The Our World Heritage Initiative is created by individuals working on 100% voluntary capacity. We would like to point out that Our World Heritage provides an open dialogue platform that is based on voluntary work of session organizers and speakers. Our World Heritage welcomes diverse viewpoints in the spirit of collegial debate where mutual respect is afforded to all. Please note that the expressed views do not necessarily reflect the official position of Our World Heritage. We thank today's speakers for telling their stories, and we thank you, the listeners, for your kind interest and questions. If you want to remain up to date on our activities, you can follow our social media. We maintain channels in multiple languages to break through the language barriers and connect to local communities. You will find all links on our website, ourworldheritage.org. Thank you for being with us today, and we wish you a very fruitful event.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, for this introduction, and good day to all of you. I'm Francesco Banderin. I'm a member of the advisory board of the Our World Heritage, and on behalf of our organization, I would like to welcome to all of you to this webinar, which has, as you know, a very interesting, stimulating, and title: Unsilencing the Past. For those of you that don't know much about us, let me just spend 2 minutes, explaining what we are and what we are planning to do. Our organization was born in 2019, 2020, actually during the COVID. That made it very easy because everybody was at home, so we could actually reach a large number of friends, people that are motivated and engaged in the World Heritage Convention. And we decided to create an organization that had a scope of expanding the voice of civil society in the discussions and in the management of the convention, in the policy making, and so on. So I think we have a very broad scope and very ambitious also. And of course, we are just at the beginning of our activity. So we would like to also benefit from your contributions and make this network of people, which is quite extended at the moment, because I think in the past year we had over 3,000 people that attended and that are now members of our newsletter. As we think that the convention has now reached a point that requires perhaps a reflection on its future. It's a 50 years old tool, which has reached very important benchmarks, and it's a very successful tool for heritage conservation. At the same time, it has a lot of issues that have not been extensively or even at all clarified, that are now, in fact, at the core of many concerns of our modern societies. So we would like to help this process, to somehow open up the discussion, open up the framework of the convention to needs that are emerging both from east and west, south and north of the world, and that have not been yet properly addressed. The scope of this year of debates, as you saw in the presentation, we call it 2021 debate. We have organized 12 themes, one per month. So every month there is a theme, and this month is the one on Beyond the List. We call it as a reflection on the list and its needs of reforming. It's to create this community of people that are interested and motivated in bringing up changes in the way the convention is understood, practiced, managed, and so on. Of course, it's very ambitious. We don't think we have yet started, perhaps we just scratched the surface of this process, but I think we have at least created a big and important platform for that. So we welcome this discussion because the one that is proposed now by our, coordinators touches really very much at the heart of this problematics. You know, we need to reflect on what kind of narrative is accompanies the inscription of sites. Very often this narrative is very unilateral. Very often, as you mentioned in the introduction, is linked to a kind of a nationalistic approach to heritage. Very often it doesn't include the multiple story that always exists in places and so on. It so somehow makes a selection and somehow distorts the meanings that heritage sites have for many parts of the society. So I think that by opening up this issue, which can be complex to deal with and sometimes even controversial, we are helping the process of reflection in this very, very important dimension of heritage conservation. So I would like to just give the floor to the person who is going to coordinate this session, Alona Nitzan-Shiften. You are the one that has somehow brought all these people together. So I'd like to thank you for your efforts and your contribution, and I will give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Francesco. I hope you can all hear me. I'm organizing this webinar on behalf of the Aronson Built Heritage Research Center at the Technion, Haifa, Israel. And we are delighted to have this amazing group of people together with us. We want to explore alternative methods of raising awareness to global heritage, and we are challenging here the way that, as Francesco has already said, the way that the list is caught in the politics of nation state and reflect their power to canonize heritage. So we seek instead an active engine that perpetually identified meaningful sites for people around the world. We will hear 4 presenters that are joining us today with different way to challenge through documentation and pedagogy the kind of knowledge that we extract toward building alternatives to the list. As we group, we propose discussing the theme of silence in the past for the notion of who controls the list, toward what end, and how we challenge it. And I think that what I'll do, I'll start immediately with introducing our speaker, Uta Potgeiser. I think I did my Israeli pronunciation, Mark Zarzenbach, and Stefan Fay and Katie Graham. I will introduce each one of you separately, and Uta would have to leave us midway. So I think that we'll have a little discussion after every speaker, and then we'll join the larger themes. So Uta is professor for heritage and technology at TU Delft in the Netherlands since 2018, and professor of building construction and materials at the Detman School of Architecture and Interior Architecture at the University of Applied Science and Art, Germany. In theory and practice, she's concerned with the protection, reuse, and rehabilitation of the built heritage and environment. She is a licensed architect and acts as vice chair of DOCOMOMO Germany and as chair of the DOCOMOMO International Specialist Committee on Technology, both since 2016. And the news is, and a better understanding of the project Uta would talk about is from 2022, she will be the chair of DOCOMOMO International. She was also appointed as professor of interior architecture at Faculty of Design at University of Antwerp, Belgium. And She started all this journey studying architecture at TU Berlin and received a dissertation at TU Dresden-Both in Germany. So our German-Dutch representative will talk about the Momo project. And Ute, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Alona, and thank you, Francesco, and also Mikey. So the whole group of our World Heritage for including me and also my colleague Anica, you will see into this presentation. So it's very interesting for me also to see and listen to the other contributions around the world related to that topic. And I have prepared a short presentation, so I guess I can share my screen. I will just try. I know it's not activated, so I'm not sure if Mikey can maybe give me allow to share the screen. I hope so.
Done.
Done. Okay, great. So then I think Francesco has to stop sharing the screen, and then I will be able to share.
Sorry. Is that okay now?
Share my screen.
Is that okay
But
now?
a very nice picture, Francesco. Yeah. That's, okay, so I will share and open my PowerPoint, or have it already open. There it is. And I hope you can. Can you see the full screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so as already introduced by Alona, I present a project that we are doing, or a course that we are giving at the Detmold School of Architecture and Interior Architecture in Germany. And which is connected to also, of course, the activities which we think, or this is a contribution to connect to the activities of DocuMomo International and of DocuMomo as another volunteers organization, not with a special focus on World Heritage though, like your organization, but with the general focus on heritage and on modern heritage. And I also like to mention Anica Dragutinovic, who is also with us in this meeting, who is a research assistant and a PhD of mine in Delft, and who is Serbian and who is working on New Belgrade in her dissertation. Good. So far, I mean, what are we doing? I mean, this is not a reinventing the wheel, but it is the approach to say that we would listen to the voices, let's say, of the young generation, in this case, our students, which are most of them, or nearly all of them are international students, which take part in our architecture program and in our program of the Master of Integrated Design, with a focus on computational and facade design. So it's normally every year a group of about 40 students, more or less. And since actually last year, we have established a kind of collaboration with DocuMomo Germany and with the annual conference of DocuMomo Germany, which in the last year took place in the Bauhaus in Dessau, with the focus on infrastructure. Now you see here on the left-hand side just a short impression, the first impression from the results, which is an augmented reality. I will get back later to the other aspects. We have summarized this in an online publication, which is accessible through our website. As authors, you can see next to Anica and myself, our colleague Marcia Lotto from TU Delft, who was a Marie Curie postdoc at TU Delft, and who was working on the digitization of museums and of museum archives. So we always also join with colleagues from the field that could give also an input, maybe from another discipline. In this sense, it was here the contribution to learn from the digitization of archives and libraries and artworks that in a certain way, I think, is already more advanced than in the field of architecture. And on the other hand, I would like to bring to your attention again what is the core work or the core or reason for the founding of DocoMomo in 1989, then back in the Netherlands. I guess most of you are familiar with the abbreviation of DocoMomo, which stands for Documentation and Conservation of Modern Movement. And to do this documentation, DocoMomo has implemented the so-called fishes. You can see it here, full documentation fish, which is a simple Word document that often is transferred into a PDF, and that gives is a kind of data sheet that documents certain buildings with the aim, of course, to also raise the awareness for those buildings. Within the last 5 years, DocoMomo International has increased this homework, not just to the documentation of the original buildings, but also to the documentation of conservation cases, as the name says, documentation and conservation of modern movement. And of course, very often these documented buildings are famous buildings, are iconic buildings, many of them or some of them also World Heritage buildings, but with a very high significance, let's say a heritage maybe value. And DocoMomo has always is also established a few years ago within the presidency of the ongoing presidency of Ana Toys in Lisbon, this DocoMomo virtual exhibition. And this is where the term of Mo Move comes from. It is the Momo virtual exhibition, Mo Move. And this is what we took as an opportunity to say, well, how can we bring this knowledge of the fishes, of the homework, of the knowledge that is incorporated in the many members of DocoMomo into a broader perspective, and also to a broader dissemination and distribution. And I guess most of you will be academics, so you are also familiar with the term of the non-written output that has really come to has been brought to our attention by the newest changes with the San Francisco research document, the DORA, where it says that actually we as academics should also look for our communication into the society, into also to address laymen, and before all to look at the impact that our research might have in society. Well, starting with that, you can see that we had this kind of input also for the students of like how are digital technologies, in particular are augmented and virtual reality, already used in cultural institutions. So that was a guest, Marcia, as our guest critic in the course, has brought a lot of new information into that. And what you can see here is the layout of our documentation. And we also looked into a pedagogic scheme, which is also not ours and not a new one, but nevertheless we thought it really starts at where we also want to start. It is at everybody's individual memory, or of course it might be a collective memory, but since we are addressing here students from different countries who are mostly likely individuals, we thought we would like them to start with being affected by remembering things from their own past, maybe from their country, not as a national point of view, as we discussed, and a national point of view as it might be often represented in UNESCO, but national rather understood as a cultural aspect, as something that might be specific, and then also brings a differentiation in the way of how they remember and how they understand their heritage. And yeah, maybe let's stop it here. So this is how the results in the end are represented also on our websites, and the symbols that we use to visualize it show us. So these are movies, these are websites, these are 3D models, and other kind of digital products that then describe the buildings or sites that were made. And as you can see, students really were free. So we allowed them to choose the tool they preferred. So some of them started to make drawings, to combine drawings, collage-like. Others worked with digital tools of 3D models with 360-degree virtual augmented reality. So it's an interesting mix of different tools, which we were not giving as a kind of prerequisite, but which they could choose freely. This is the website where you can still find the movies, which is on our Detmold Design Transfer Online website, which is the showroom of our student activities. And part of it is it's still called DocuMomo, but we will change it into MoMove, the title of this exhibition. So MoMove 21, MoMove 22, and onwards. Now, what were the themes and the topics that the students were interested in? They started with a kind of literature review, as we normally do in academia. So what is the state of the art? Just go back once, as the state of the art. And by looking at these literature reviews that the students did, we could find that they were mainly interested in specific themes. So at the end, we came across to cluster the topics that the students have prepared. So one of the topic is the aspect of sustainability and reuse. And I just jump relatively quickly through the pages. You can also have a look at them. You see there are even the websites, and if you go into the publication. So this was the topic related to the reuse of power plants, and also to talk about the health risks of power plants. So that was a concern the students were investigating in, and how that changes over time by the reuse of traditional power stations. The adaptive reuse of power station. This is a movie that 3 students did by putting themselves in the role of the observers, and how that is related to the new Green Deal of the European Union. Here a more typologically one about the reuse of water towers in Germany. The comparison of infrastructures of industry within the historical city context, and within the more rural areas, where the companies, as you can see here, grow bigger than the cities, and and what this kind of relation makes, or how it impacts the sustainability, the resources of a city. One student who was talking about the urban development of Beirut, of course, also with the focus on the explosion that happened there last year. We had another group of students that rather worked on themes like aesthetics, construction and function, like a group that dived into the facade innovations and functions of modern facades, and their aspects, the development typologies of the gas station in Germany, another movie, the typologies of townhouses, the corporate architecture as a comparison of Peter Behrens and the AEG architecture and the Siemens architecture. So 2 different types of electrical energies, and one group that dealt with the Bauhaus. Unfortunately, we could not publish that because all the images of Gropius from the inside the Bauhaus are protected with copyrights. Nevertheless, they created an interesting app. And the third group was dealing with aspects of inclusion and participation, which I think was also very nice. So a group of students from Kosovo, Iran, and Algeria created a kind of access of how the buildings, perception of specific buildings changed over time in little movies. We had students from Jordan that took a hangar infrastructure from the 1940s and transferred it into a virtual exhibition room for student works. We had a group that compared the Frankfurt Kitchen in an augmented reality. The Frankfurt Kitchen, we have one here in Detmold, an original one, and they explored another one from Frankfurt, from the archives, and visualized that the functioning. And just to give an outlook to our ongoing course, where we are dealing with industrial heritage. You're also invited to join our Docomomo Germany conference on the 26th of February in Essen at Zeche Zollverein, which is a World Heritage Site, as you all know. And yeah, this is a funny picture. So this is the group of students who joined also the UNESCO conference in October. And you see this person here, this is the General Secretary of UNESCO, the UNESCO Germany Commission. And so they were very keen of having our students there. So learning about how World Heritage is treated at the moment, at the same time, bringing in their own perspective. And let's say 3/4 of the group will deal with buildings from the World Heritage site at Zollverein. I think I just go through that rather quickly. These are first impressions from the work they are dealing with, which has just started a month ago. And maybe also linked to that is another activity we do, that is that we also do a kind of introducing master workshop at the beginning of the semester for all new master students, where they also work across with movies they produce in 2 days in interdisciplinary groups and on different scales, dealing with a given theme, which was also the SDGs this year. Well, to conclude, you can also see that in a virtual exhibition on our website, which is the Detmold Conference Week, which took place last week, where these things are exhibited. You just have to register for the conference week. And well, to conclude, what we see is that there are specific approaches and themes that, let's say, the young people are concerned with, and that they find important to mention, and which they express within these virtual exhibits that they produce. Yeah, thank you. I think this was my last slide, and I hoped I kept within the 15 to 20 minutes time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uta. This was eye-opening, and it captures some of the things that we wanted to deal with, about putting documents, academic education, generational depiction of heritage. And I think that I'll open this kind of question for this bottom-up, diverse, technologically updated generation of knowledge to the larger community to ask. I'll maybe start with one question that questions the nature of the document itself, especially as part of Docomomo. What does it mean to have a document? Do you differentiate? For example, you've shown them the pages that had a format that seems to have particular information, but students had the freedom to document in all kinds of media and sometimes artistic expression. So what does it mean about the document as Docomomo, for example, would see?
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting question. It was actually, I think, not to maybe replace the fiches, how they are called, so the data sheet, the fact sheets of Docomomo, but rather to complement them with personal impression and with personal statements, because I think it cannot replace a proper historical building analysis or a proper documentation, as it is of course normally also needed to make a listing of a building or to make a significance assessment. So what the students do is rather a partial approach to those topics that they consider the most important ones. And in that sense, I think it's not a replacement. And we still have to discuss, I think, what the Momo virtual exhibition is. At the moment, the virtual exhibition at the DocoMomo International website are rather photographs that are put by people with the location, of course, which also complements the traditional fishes that are there. I'm not sure if Alona can listen or if she can hear us. She looks a bit frozen. Yep, there she's back. Alona, I'm not sure if you could listen because you were, your image was frozen. We can't hear you.
Alona, you're on mute.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've listened to most of it. Thanks so much. I've missed the end. And I'm just telling to the entire team that because my connection is not completely stable, if I'm off, then maybe somebody else will take off until I'm back. But I'll catch up in the video. I don't want to make you repeat the end of it, but I'm opening the floor to questions.
I just saw there is a question in the chat asking from Mark Watson to what happened to the plan to make Zollverein a bigger cultural landscape across the Ruhrgebiet. I must say, maybe I'm not the right person to answer that at the moment, but I hope that Kurt actually, which is under the name of Uta here, Kurt C. Reinhardt, from who is, let's say, a long-term collaborator and an expert on Zollverein, and who is actually also our guest in this year's course in Detmold. And you see, he's very corporate with the image of Zollverein in the back. So, I mean, Kurt, I don't know, maybe you can tell a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. Highly interesting for me. Yes, I'm professionally, I usually work as a consultant, very much passionate to science. And the process has stopped by a political decision after it has been cancelled the first time because it was a little bit confused in the first attempt to enlarging what they call the industrial cultural landscape from a more social historical and less a morphological or architectural point of view. And of course, to create an outstanding universal value, it was, in my humble opinion, predictable that the UNESCO committee denied on a national level already the attempt to inscribe it on the World Cultural Heritage List. And the second time now, they have it even enlarged it much more, made it more confused and made it more political. And so it was stopped on the level of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia Cultural Ministry, which I think was a good thing, because most of the people who were taking part in this process didn't know that you need a management plan and what it means to be a World Cultural Heritage on the operative level, which the requirements to be a World Cultural Heritage and to protect all these structures which were on the tentative list to be inscribed. If you need more, we can exchange much more information about the list and the criteria they were offering. What could be, if you're deeper research of the theme of perception, which was addressed already here, like national and international perception of world cultural heritage. Already the inscription of Zollverein, as it was suggested to the UNESCO, was an industrial cultural landscape with the dwellings of the workers around and the quarters, was reduced to the genuine side, which is readable in the documents on the UNESCO website, where the justification of the inscription is described. It's a highly interesting document if you talk about the topic of perception from a regional, national level. There it was inscribed as an industrial monument, and totally different criteria out of the 6 criteria for the World Cultural Heritage were applied, and in the perception of the UNESCO committee was this criteria 2 and 3, and a totally different justification. It's exactly to this topic. Zollverein is an interesting theme. Thank you.
May I come back on that? My congratulations to Zollverein on the 20 years since it was inscribed. I was there in Helsinki when that happened. There was no discussion about the size of the site at that time. I think maybe all the discussions about whether the workers' housing, the place where the slave labor may well have been encamped as well, that wasn't pursued at the time of the inscription. But I'm also aware that from a meeting in 2014 in Dortmund, there was a plan to have a much larger site, which maybe is the one that has now been withdrawn for political reasons, but that would have had the opportunity to engage with many more people living in a World Heritage Site in a similar way to Bassin Minière in France, or the Cornish tin and metal mining World Heritage Site in Cornwall in England. And I think the landscape model, with admittedly extra management challenges, is perhaps a more inclusive one than simply to focus on a technological ensemble, which is what UNESCO tends to assign to the term that it assigns to industrial places to try and exclude people.
Thank you very much. I suggest that when we bring up particular cases that demonstrate well the issue, you'll introduce the entire crowd to the relevance to this, to what we are doing, and this is indeed very relevant. So Uta, if you want to connect this to the kind of method that you were suggesting, and now it can interact. So if you want to do it earlier, if not, I would like to ask Mark, who had the question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, if there's time. Thank you, Uta, for that presentation. Just a quick question. You talked about your students coming from all over the world, which I think is common for all of us now. How do you deploy that? I mean, what is the sensibility that one has to develop, you know, in order to basically get as much out of that internationality as possible?
Yeah, so maybe you said that's quite normal for all of us. I still have to say that in many German universities, I'm not talking about Delft, but in many German universities, it is not that common at all, because most of our education is still in German. And we are one of the few, I would say, still master programs, at least in architecture. That might be different for MBAs or other kind of things. So in that sense, it's I think it was a rather more unique position for us, at least in Germany now, to do that. Yeah, it's a different question. I'm rather exploring it, you know, like what kind of sensitivity. Most of the students that we have in that course, as I said, they are computational and facade design. They might even not have heard about heritage, and their studies worldwide are of course quite different, with very different focus in their studies. So that means that in the first point, that, as you are familiar with different cultures, different nations, and maybe even different backgrounds of students, you first have to lay a ground, at least shortly, about what is heritage and how is it normally accessed. We do that in a certain framework, but in this case, we rather even we gave 1 or 2 only introductory lecturers for this course, you know, and then really told them, well, try to develop your personal connection with it. I mean, that is, of course, a matter of curriculum design and of time that you have available. But we try to keep it quite short, because they also need time to actually develop this exhibit, yeah, which they do in teams. This is not individual works, they do it in teams.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Other questions to Uta?
I see there were questions in the chat of 2 questions of Dennis. So what outreach is there beyond academia? And there continues to be a congenial resistance to modern heritage. How are you breaking this down beyond academia? Yeah, that are good questions. Dennis, I don't know how far we really go beyond academia at the moment. Because we have just started to publish these results now on our faculty website, and soon then on the DocoMomo website, which is still a quite academic environment, although DocoMomo also has professionals. What we do, and maybe that's something which I haven't mentioned, that we really also bring the students to the conferences, which I would say often only happens on a PhD level, you know, when they really are starting to, maybe on a master level, but that we also have the students presenting in our main conference, and not in a poster presentations in the lunch break when everybody is preferring to have, I don't know, his lunch being eaten. I'm not so much a fan of these poster sessions, which so they really present. But that is still a question that we have to further explore, I would say. What can we do with these exhibits and results to make it accessible? Your second question part was the resistance towards modern heritage. I mean, here I must say that actually the students, that once they have discovered their personal theme, that they open up, so that I guess a lot of resistance towards modern heritage comes from that, well, it is ugly, it is simplistic, it is maybe a bit brutal, or it is not in a good condition, maybe when it refers to housing, so it is experimental in construction. At least with the students, I have found that they look beyond that, because they look into these aspects of what can we do with the existing buildings. So more this aspect of resource scarcity, of circularity, which is much more in their focus than it maybe was in the generation of their parents or of the broader population. So they, I think they open up a quite wide range of values and attributes that they could connect with it. So that's not their primary concern. I hope that answers.
Thanks.
Well, I
yes.
was spurred to ask the questions because I think it was you, Jutta, who said that you assumed that everybody here was from academia. Well, I'm not. So that's my starting point. And the second starting point is that I come from the United Kingdom, and I've been through phases. Georgian architecture, 18th century architecture was regarded as rubbish. So city centers were destroyed. Victorian architecture, the century later, that was regarded as rubbish, and something like St. Pancras Station was due to be demolished. And we're now in a period where the other two are okay now, but modern architecture is not. And the problem that I have seen right the way through is that academia and everybody who's attached to academia focuses on a narrow perspective of cultural value. They do not look broader to usefulness, to sustainability, to the issues of our time to do with climate change and exploration of the world's resources and embodied energy. And to me, these narratives need to be changed. We should not be looking at simply the question of whether it's ugly or not, but whether it's useful and whether it is actually a resource in every sense, but less so in financial, which is useful today and will be useful today, tomorrow. And these are the issues which I think needs to come across in all aspects of heritage, whether it be modern heritage or whether it be anything else, to broaden the narrative that we're telling. So that was really why I raised the questions.
Yeah,
so you're
thank you.
encouraging me. You're encouraging me. I have written for Momo,
Yeah.
so I'm familiar with Momo, and I've written about modern heritage in Scotland and probably a few other places as well, like Asmara and Kaunas. So I am familiar, but it's a question of extending the perception of values beyond the delimited cultural ones is an important, vital part of the exercise of communication.
Yeah, okay, so then it's fine. I think I can encourage you that many of those students rather saw the other aspects, as you mentioned them, beyond address these aspects there of.
Thank you very much.
That's great. I think we concluded with the great contribution because the idea was to bring a new generation and to have a much less mediated connection to heritage. So we'll keep this idea of how we expand and go beyond the list. And Uta, I don't know, we don't have much time, but I'm just throwing the question that you may have answered before, but and we'll go on about if it's complementary what you're doing or the actual new media can revise the core document of that we register and work with. I think this connects to what we'll hear next.
Yeah, I mean, I said it like from my point of view perspective today. I consider it as to be rather complementary because it is not replacing a complete, for example, historical research or a building analysis, because the students focus on the aspects that they consider the most important from a very personal point of view. They don't have to justify why they choose for the topic of health and power stations or for the topic of reuse and embedded energy. So that is up to them. So I consider it as complementary, but it might be that in the near future, this will become part of the holistic assessment to significance, and will then describe part of it, the perception part, or just telling the storytelling in terms of communication, because rather than reading a document for the World Heritage listing, which I guess is not something everybody will do, it might be a good idea to present the most the outstanding values, which could also be extended, the outstanding values in a movie, for example. And I just want shortly answer, there was another question. Could you mention again the Momo seminar about industrial heritage? It's a course that we do in Germany, in Detmold, in this semester with students. So Elsa was asking that. So it's an ongoing seminar that we're doing, and we finish it for February 2022.
Thank you very much, Uta. I think we'll take this theme and continue with Professor Mark Zarzenbach, and who has founded an architectural history teaching collaborative, a global one that talks teacher to teacher rather than teacher to students and connecting all of them to the public. I'll introduce you, Mark, and then we'll weave the themes together. Mark is a professor of the history and theory of architecture at MIT. He works on a wide range of topics, both historical and theoretical. He's one of the country's leading advocates for global history and has published several books and articles on that topic, including the groundbreaking textbook entitled A Global History of Architecture. Zarzenbach has organized several major international conferences on topics such as Holocaust Memorial, Architecture and Cultural Studies, and East European Architecture. He was the founding faculty editor of Threshold, an annual peer-reviewed journal produced by the Department of Architecture. I can testify that Mark is the one that constantly challenged the boundaries of our discipline, and therefore it is a pleasure to have you here with us, Mark. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Ilona, for the invitation and to speak to you all today. I'm going to try my usual screen share situation. No.
Okay, works.
Oops.
Oh, almost.
Almost.
Yes, here it is.
All right. So I'm going to talk about some work that I've been doing over the last maybe 6 or 7 years that started very sort of casually and informally. I've been traveling around the world a lot, but then about 6 years ago, my wife and I said, well, you know, we don't really know that much about Massachusetts. So, you know, let's spend every weekend and drive around and look at our neighborhood, because we only moved here in '95. And after 10 or 15 years, we realized we didn't really know too much about the local history. So we thought that would be a good thing to do. And so this work sort of comes out of that. And it was a bit of a shock to me because my sons who grew up in Massachusetts, you know, didn't even know the history that I'm going to talk to you about. So it was sort of a eye-opening to me how, you know, I could be here and live here. And in some sense, the very history and the trauma of the land is something that is not discussed at all. So not too far from where I live, you know, is one of these things that we looked at, which is this strange rock here, memorial. And it says, to Sagamore John and the mystic Indians whose bones lie here. And this was when they laid out these houses in 1880, they came across this, this tomb. And they're not sure exactly if it belongs to, quote, Sagamore John. Sagamore is the word for chief. And basically, it belongs to Mashawanak people who lived here, but they were completely decimated by the smallpox that took place, outbreak in 1619. And so this is, they lived along the Mystic River here. So this is one of several of these sort of bits and pieces of memory that sort of are, you know, cluttered around the site around which I'm living. Not too far away, about a mile away, is the Pisquasit Park. And so we went there. It's a baseball field. You can sort of see the street sign and so forth like that, named after the Pisquasit, who lived, you know, nowhere nearby, actually, maybe about 3 or 4 miles away, near Watertown. And so I thought, oh, that's great. They have a, you know, it's an Indian name and so forth like that. But then when I discovered how it was named, you know, it all of a sudden becomes a little bit more difficult. So just to remind us that the smallpox outbreak took place before the arrival of the English. The Spanish came up the coast here to do fishing, and the Portuguese, and someone must have gone on the shore and talked to the people, and so the smallpox spread before the Pilgrims arrived. And so when the Pilgrims arrived, this is a guy called Thomas Morton. The bones and skulls of several places of their habitations made such a spectacle after my coming to these parts that I travailed in the forest near Massachusetts, and it seemed to me a newfound Golgotha. And what had happened was the people would be just dying and they were abandoned. And so entire villages were just sort of boneyards, as were discovered by these people. Now, the irony, of course, is that we're called after a tribe called the Massachusetts. And the designation was created not by anybody, who knew who they were. It was a name on a map. And in 1629, these people in England said, we want to go over there. And they just picked this name on the map and said, okay, let's call us up Massachusetts. And by the way, we can only get money to do this charter if we Christianize them. So let's write our charter here and let's put it on the top here. Come over and save us. So they did that, and still today the Massachusetts Sachem is portrayed on our map. So as a citizen of Massachusetts, I began to ask myself, I'm being represented by a Native American on the seal of Massachusetts. They didn't know how they dressed. They thought they were Caribbeans, and walked around naked. Then they came here and discovered that no, they actually had clothes. And so somewhere on the way, they gave them some beautiful deerskin clothing. So, the question was, as a citizen of Massachusetts, I bear the responsibility of asking myself, well, what does that mean? It's different if you're, let's say, the citizen of Texas or other places in the United States, which have different types of names, but I bear that name. So the first guy to map this area, he didn't land, but he mapped it, and he was from England, and he came back to England, and then Prince Charles said, what the hell are all these names? I don't know these names. Give me good English names. So he named all this entire territory after English names, and Massachusetts, who are located here, was named London because that was the capital of this area, and so he nicknamed them London. And so when the colonists wanted to arrive, they wanted to go to as close as possible to the capital, what they thought was the capital. So they landed here in Charles River, named, of course, after Prince Charles and later King Charles. And all the names like, Cambridge and Dartmouth and all of that stuff, all this comes from this guy's sort of map. So if we look at an early then map of Boston, which is like in textbooks and so forth, and it shows the little town and then all the farms and so forth and so on, we think, okay, this is a very good representation of what this story was like. But actually, this is a falsification because we have to put this map over the larger territory. So they land here in 1630, and they're basically moving westward up the Charles River because that's where they needed land for horses and cows and cattle. So the farmers sort of had closer downstream, and the cattle people went upstream to a place called Watertown. But the problem was the land to their west was where the Massachusetts were, and that afterwards they were named. So they were not, Massachusetts did not control the Charles River. They controlled a river called the Neponset River, and they had an extensive territory. So unlike the Native Americans to the north, who had pretty much suffered quite dramatic decline because of the diseases, the diseases here only sort of began to become apparent in the 1620s and 1630s. So they were still relatively robust presence. And so the Bostonians had a problem with them because they weren't, just going to disappear. And so the Massachusetts world is this sort of world along the Neponset River. And today, if you try to reconstruct that world, it's practically impossible. It's completely almost evaporated away, given the expansion of the city and given what happened. So this was at that time in the 1640s, basically a frontier town. So it's hard to imagine, a frontier town situation, but that's what I'm trying to sort of evoke here. And basically it had different dynamics, complicated story. The Western movement here to the Charles River basically had survivors who lived here in a place in Newton called Waban. I'll mention that in a second. The southern ones here we have to imagine from the settler colonial point of view, was a tribal zone and highly contested. And so these were not easily Christianized, and they were very resistant to Christianize. They really didn't want the English around. But so they had their main London was here in a place called Massachusetts, and then in summer, in winter, they would camp here inland along a sacred lake. So there are bits and pieces of this in the neighborhood. And, you know, you can sort of find here like this arbitrary marker here, says the Massachusetts hummock, the seat of the sachem of the tribe of Indians from which the colony and the province derived the name. But, you know, they don't say anything about how that derivatoriness came about. Massachusetts basically means near the Great Hill, which is the Blue Hill down south from here. So this is the hummock. A hummock means a small hill, the Massachusetts hummock. And here I am sitting on or near where Chief Chickatabuk would have had his wigwam. And it's a beautiful area. You can sort of see this would have been completely populated by Native American cities and towns, as we know from descriptions. So this cultural landscape, which sort of works its way sort of in this sort of direction, had basically a summer area and a winter area. And here's the Blue Hill, which was their spiritual mountain after which they were named. So down here is the Punkapoag, which was their summer residence around the lake, and the lake still is there. It's gorgeous, beautiful. You can visit it. It's now a park, and so you can sort of see. And then there was a trail that connected them to the summer area here, which was famous for its fishing and for its clams and for all this type of thing. So there was no want of food. They had farms here and so forth like that. So if you go to the Punkapoag today, you go to there, one of the ways to get access to it is through the golf course. So the sacred lake is now a golf course, and you go to the Punkapoag golf shop and get punky hats and punky t-shirts and so forth like that. So the narrative that is around here, if you go to all these sort of sites, is the narrative that is in the following way, which is basically successful Christianization, that these people welcomed Christ, just because that's what, you know, who would not welcome Christ, right? And then, of course, that they were good Indians. So here's a statue of Massachusetts. And, you know, on the websites and everywhere, this is the usual quotation, you know, he was the Indian chief who through his life maintained peaceful relationships with English settlers in the area of Plymouth Colony. Well, yeah, he was sort of one of those guys, but for every Massachusetts, there were, let's say, 10 tribal chiefs who were not interested in peace. And they developed a resistance movement that was quite forceful. And they something called the King Phillips War. And they almost won, and they would have driven the English back to their ships had it not been for the fact that finally the Massachusetts and the people in Providence sort of ganged together and had this brutal war of extermination. So basically what we have to sort of realize is that, you know, there was once 100% of the population was Native American. Today it's 1%. Obviously it declined because of disease. Then there was the King Phillips War, in which the losers were deported to the Bahamas as slaves. They were put on Deer Island here in the harbor for starvation. And then the rest were put in basically internment camps in and around on Cape Cod and so forth. And then the land was now available for, quote, purchase. So the other thing that is narrated around here, this is in the Arlington Post Office, is that the English came and they bought the land. So here you're seeing there's a Native American, and there's taking 2 silver coins for the land, and they're already settling here, right? Happy people with the farm in the background. So of course, this is also mythology because you know, the Puritans were very legalistic in mind, and so they had to tell themselves that they were buying this land, but they had already sort of exterminated the people. So buying the land was, you know, for a few pennies was sort of, you know, not really the real story. So, this is sort of a falsification of the story. And the question is like, when did that falsification sort of happen? And it turns out it wasn't just an arbitrary thing, it was a concerted effort that took place from the 1860s roughly to about 1930. And after 1930, this falsified narrative was finished. And basically, when you travel around Massachusetts today, that's the story you get. So there are these signs everywhere like this, hundreds and hundreds of them that were done in 1930. You can sort of see 1630, 1930 for the 300th anniversary of the landing of the Puritans. And basically they sort of Indianized the landscape, even though there were no Indians around, or they certainly weren't asked about their version of the story. The reason they did this was because Boston was going through huge transformation at the time with immigrants. So immigrants were coming. They were Italians, they were and Polish, who were largely Catholics. And this was a Protestant stronghold, and they just did not want the Catholics to sort of mess up their history here. And then there were also Jews coming in from Russia and elsewhere. And so the Boston elites were very, very concerned that the history would be lost. So they produced this sort of narrative to make sure that the immigrants sort of knew who was boss, so to speak, which was the Brahmin Bostonians, and everyone else didn't belong, to that history. So it was a sort of a double exclusion, because the immigrants weren't allowed to sort of be part of the history, and they had to sort of adopt now the local history, which was this sort of simplified version. So these are the signages that get made all over the place. And 2030 is coming up pretty soon. So it's pretty soon going to be a sort of a hot button issue. So these streets and these signs and the parks and murals, which all seem very neutral. And so I was interested in these sort of small scale little things that are not big, hot button issues. These are not Confederate statues here, right? These are little things like my street sign down the road, the Pisquasit Road. I mean, that they shape a Native American history, which is a very strange one, right? Because it produces a cultural landscape that is basically a settler colonial landscape. And it's so widespread and so rooted in who we are today that we don't even see it as a settler colonial phenomenon. It's quite odd too, because so here's a map from 1700, not too far from where I live, and you can sort of see there's a place called Nonantum Hill, and there's a guy, here's his Waban's wigwam. So there's his wigwam, and Waban was the chief, and he was in charge of the refugees who were gathering together in this sort of area just west of where I live. And they put him there in this sort of area. And then if you go there today, you see, once again, there's a golf course, and this is where his wigwam would have been on the 23rd hole, next to a spring, his sacred spring, which is like now a water hole. And this is where on top of the hill, which is somebody's backyard, and I snuck in there and got this photograph from $1 million house. So I'm gonna have to do some walking around because I notice my computer's gonna be off dying a little bit. So I'm just gonna don't worry about the background. So this is Lightfoot Wixon, who was the last native speaker off the Wampanoag, and he can sort of see he died in 2003. So it's not true that this history is a history that took place back then and doesn't impact us anymore today. The Native American world still is with us. It's just that, as I said, it's sort of 0.01% of the population. And so their voice is practically sort of zero from a political point of view. But that doesn't mean we have no obligations as citizens to understand what's going on here. So the late 19th century erasure was a distinct political moment that actually included the Native American world into this culture in order to sort of create a mythological understanding of how it works. So, in some moments, like this is a story about a woman who was held captive by Native Americans, and she was sort of seen as a hero because she fought back. She chopped the heads off their captors and brought the bodies to Boston, and she got $50 for it, and seen as a hero, and they made a statue for her in the 1890s, and it was recently vandalized. So there's a sort of a sub energy around here to sort of rethink all of these monuments. So the basic sort of timeline is something like this: from 14,000 BC, roughly, to 1620, we have Native American culture, right? Then comes the disease, enforced Christianization, deportation, land deprivation. The population is decimated. And then in the 1860s, now that these people are no longer seen as active, the street names, parks, statues begin to proliferate. And then by 1930, with the 300th anniversary, it's going gangbusters, and it's sort of signed, sealed, and delivered. And so today we live in a normalized post-settler colonial world. And so the question is, what do we do about it? And so this is a big problem, because we're living in the residue of this sort of doubly sort of a double negative, if you will, right? Not only was it of the history itself, but also of the subsequent retelling and its fraudulence. So, of course, today, anyone working this has to include the Native Americans. And so much of my work today includes activists in the local community, many of them part of the North American Indian Center or part of the tribal affiliations, the Wampanoag today. But I'm not Native American, obviously. But I feel that this is an obligation that non-Native Americans have to participate in, because we're living in the residue of the settler colonial environment. But yet no one in New England would see this cultural landscape as a contested one. And so that's the real problem. But yet it was and remains contested. And if you talk to any Native American, they will tell you that. And one example is that there was something called the Indian Imprisonment Act, which said that any Native American who was going into Boston needed to be escorted by 2 musketeers because they didn't trust them. Well, this was on the books until 2004. So legally, any Native American who went to Boston in 2003 would have to be accompanied by the police. So, now you would say that didn't happen. Of course it didn't happen. But every Native American that I talked to points this out. And they were told, every child to parent a child that says, be careful when you go to Boston, because someone might remember this. So these are types of things that we think are sort of, okay, that's an old thing, people have forgotten about it, but Native American community felt very strongly about it. And it was only after much, consternation did they sort of repeal this act. So the question is, what are our obligations as citizens in Massachusetts in particular, because of the name that we carry, both Native American and not Native American, sort of, and how do we sort of alter the cultural landscape? So, it's one that is, directly contingent on my personal participation, but also in sort of developing other sense of community. And of course, there's something like the citizenship ontology, right? I have an obligation, my neighbors should have an obligation, even though I don't think they care one hoot about this. But it also means that I have to sort of see myself sort of in more or less be ontological. I have to sort of say, maybe my point here is not to assert who I am, but a little bit undersert who I am not. And in other words, I am a non-Native American. And what does that non mean in this particular situation, and what kind of obligations are there? So in the end, I just would think would be, when we talk about our heritage, world heritage, the question is, what is the our? What do we mean by that word, and who constructs it? So in this particular case, the our, is already falsely constructed by people in the past. So if we want to make a new our, we have to obviously include the Native American voices, but we also have to include a better understanding of how settler colonial history has worked in the landscape. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for raising these amazing questions. I will open the stage maybe for clarification questions, for a few questions, and then we'll have a larger discussion after the last talk. So Any questions for Mark?
There is one in the chat.
In the chat. Okay, greeting marks from an expert Bostonian. This is from Kaylee Mallon. Really interesting and timely talk, because I myself have heard current Bostonians use Indigenous place names and proof of Massachusetts inclusively and diversity, which it seems would be very much the opposite. Do you know if the methodolization of the first Thanksgiving and subsequent celebration also originated in the same movement that you've spoken about?
I don't know the precise answer to that, but I could probably, do some digging and sort of find out. But there's no doubt that the drumbeat about Thanksgiving in the early 20th century played a lot into sort of reenactment mythologies of colonial arrival. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And you're also right. I mean, when I first arrived, it was like, yeah, we were friends with the Indians liked us. And look, there's statues everywhere. We're good. We're okay. We know what diversity is. And that was what was so shocking to me when I began to do this research. I realized it was a charade, and we have bit into, we're the second generation, or whatever you want to call it, from the 1930s to today, maybe the third generation, that have just naturalized that story without really thinking about it. And that's, really dangerous in my view. It just sort of shows how easy it is, the survivors' stories win.
So, Mark, you're actually challenging the entire system, because you say the list has to reconsider settler colonialism that will never be acknowledged properly by nation state parties. And you're giving this kind of here it's almost an American heritage, because they were putting the names on and so on. So the question I'm really curious about the people that are more familiar with the ICOMOS and UNESCO protocol. How can we revise, and if you have any idea about how can one revise the settler colonial notion, and being in a place where settler colonialism is not so difficult to dig, it brings even more acute questions about.
It's a very, very difficult question, because we think sort of, for a long time, colonialism was what the English did in India, right? Or what the Europeans did in Africa. And so that's one form of colonialism. But settler colonialism is everywhere in the States, all the Americas, right? Or is a settler colonial nationalism. And basically every nation state in the Americas first started in some form of sort of settler colonial attitude. And so how does one separate out, the national narratives, from the problematics of the settler colonial narratives? Bostonians are very eager to show that they've created the nation here, right? This is what part of their narrative was, to say, listen, we, the New Englanders, are the nation. And they were seeing it as sort of to counteract the Southern argument, right, of Virginia and the plantation world, right? They saw themselves as, small farmers making themselves, available in the world, where they open to religion, they open to diversity and all these type of things, unlike in the South. So it was a sort of a moment when, which narrative was going to play itself out. And this was during, it began to sort of evolve after the Civil War. So, from their point of view, they were seeing the better nation. So they were sort of, so in other words, they didn't have time to sort of be too sympathetic to the reality of the ground, right? Because they were said, you know, we have to fight two different types of nations here, right? One is the plantation nation of the South, and one is the New England small-scale farmer nation living by itself. You know, Thoreau, Emerson, you know, you put all that together, you know, it becomes quite entangled all of a sudden, right? It's not a simple thing, but it is a very dark foundation on which it all rests. And so how do we reconstitute, if you will, the Native American landscape today with the critique that we need to operate? And so it might take another 300 years.
That's a fantastic question. If there are no further immediate questions, I think we'll go to the next one and then we'll come back to it, because what our next talk will try to explore is maybe part of the of this kind of undermining the transparency of cultural landscape that you talked about, can be done through multiple stories and storytelling and different kinds of documents that show the different sides of each monument. So Mark will come back to your talk and we'll and discuss it together, and we'll introduce our two speakers who will present together the project. Professor Stefan Fay, who is a professor of programs in the Azrieli School of Architecture and Urbanism in the Faculty of Engineering and Design in Carleton University, Canada. Is the director of the Carleton Immersive Media Studio, which is Carleton University Research Center. Professor Fay holds cross appointments in the Institute of Comparative Studies in Literature, Art, and Culture. So this is a fantastic interdisciplinary contribution. His research focuses on architectural representation, architecture and religion, architecture and microhistory. Fay's current project includes documentation and dissemination of ethnocultural methods of construction, biomedical visualization, building information modeling for heritage conservation. And Kathy Graham, whom we learned is working with Steve for many years by now, received her BAs in 2008 and MArch 2010 in architecture at the Azrieli School of Architecture and Urbanism at Carleton University. She's currently completing her PhD in architecture with a focus on the relationship between architecture and virtual reality storytelling, focusing on how the emerging medium introduces new narrative possibilities. Stephen, Katie, please, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Ilona.
Thank you.
I'm going to share screen. There we go. And Katie's going to kick us off.
Yes, so I'll get started. And just to add to the bio, since I think might be outdated, I'm currently also part of the Faculty of Bachelor's Media Production and Design at Carleton University, and I've been a part of it since 2019. So I've now had the pleasure to be a part of Carleton Immersive Video Studio as associate faculty and bring about kind of a new perspective there as well. So today what we're going to talk about is a lot to do actually about the National Arts Center and a project associated with that. But before we go into that, we're going to kind of have a prelude story about the Canadian Parliament buildings. I'm going to keep saying next slide since Steve is in charge of the slides. So next slide. So I'm going to tell you the story of Parliament Hill, but it started actually before it was called Parliament Hill, when it was called Barracks Hill. And in the early 1800s, the Canadian, in Ottawa, the locks for the canal were built, and Ottawa was actually called Bytown. Then, and we'll go to the next slide. Then in 1855, I believe, yes, 1855, Bytown turned to Ottawa and the Parliament buildings were starting to be built. In 1867, Ottawa actually became the capital of Canada, and Canada became a country. So we had these new parliament buildings that became the house of the new Canadian government. We have the East Block, the West Block, and the Center Block down in the middle. Next slide. Then in 1916, the Center Block burnt down. There was a fire that started in the reading room, and the whole thing came to the ground, and it was just a skeleton. And since it was winter too, it was a frozen skeleton. Next slide. Luckily, the building was rebuilt. So a new design was created and built up with this amazing front piece that was the Peace Tower. So it became the center of the Parliament Hill, and the grounds themselves, the Parliament Hill land, became really important as well. And in 1967, to mark Canada's 100th birthday, the Centennial Flame was built in the front. Next slide. Still next slide, seems to be stuck. All right, and Parliament Building, the Center Block, stands today as the center of all of Canadian government. It is open for tours, usually open for tours for people to be able to see. Next slide. And it also houses the House of Commons, where a lot of government activity happens. Next slide. And the Senate of Canada, that is also where the Senate sits and a lot of large decisions are made. Next slide. But the building is in desperate need of repair, so it's actually currently undergoing a rehabilitation project that has it closed. So the building has been shut down. All of the government activities have moved elsewhere. There's no more tours of the building, and it's being completely revamped and brought up to new standards. Next slide. So what I just did there is I told you the story of Parliament Hill and the rehabilitation project, but I did it using multiple stories that we have created at Carleton Immersive Media Studio that all are within the digitally assisted storytelling projects, as well as modeling. So I told you that story with these 6 ones: the Point Cloud and Model, Heritage Passages, Senate Virtual Tour, the VR Kiosk, Building Canada's Parliament, and Parliament a Virtual Experience. And each one of these provides a different perspective and a different view and a different focalization to examine what is happening. But they are all of that exact same story. Before I pass it on to Steve, I'm going to go to just briefly explain what each one of these projects are. So next slide. So the first one, Point Cloud, the documentation and the modeling. This is where it kind of all began, that Carleton Immersive Media Studio was brought in to work with a government organization to help document the building and create a building information model to be used for heritage documentation as well as for the construction project. And this model is done within Revit and has amazing detail within it. Next slide. The next project was Heritage Passages, which is actually the oldest of all of these projects. I can't actually remember the year that it was built, but it was sometime maybe 2008, I want to say, as Steve will probably correct me. So anyway, this project was built in collaboration with another research lab at Carleton, I believe called Hyperlab, as well as the library at Carleton and the Bytown Museum. And it was to document the period between 1826 and 1855 that the Bytown locks were built. And this, the Bytown locks are actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And so it also is an archive of all of these different assets that are found and within the archives for Bytown. Next slide. Then we have the Senate Virtual Tour. The Senate Virtual Tour we did in collaboration with the Senate of Canada, which uses a lot of the documentation that we did from the documentation work, like 360 photographs, as well as high resolution photographs and photogrammetry, to explore the architecture, the furniture, and the artwork that is on the Senate side of the building. I think it might be frozen. You can go to the next slide, I think. All right, well, just to go a little bit more on that one, it allows you to move around and click on different hotspots to examine the what is the building like. And then the VR kiosk was created to be this walk-up VR station that people could experience these 360 videos on VR headsets in 2017 that explored in really short videos, about 2 minutes long, different aspects of the Parliament buildings and the rehabilitation project. This was done for Canada's 150th birthday. And in the 3 months that it was situated across from Parliament Hill, there was about 34,000 people who tried the experience out. So it was quite successful. And next slide. And then there's Building Canada's Parliament. This is a project that actually, unfortunately, was never fully seen out. We've only ever made it from prototype stage, but it was meant to be this website that would continue to grow every single week with a new story released that was some kind of interactive gaming experience that taught you a little bit more about the rehabilitation project, the importance of the Parliament buildings, and kind of all the details within there. And so it used a lot of game and like micro narratives of the Parliament buildings and their importance. Next slide. And then the last one is Parliament, the virtual experience. This is a project that was produced by the National Film Board and the Library of Canada. And Carleton Immersive Media Studio was brought in as collaborators to create the physical space. So we converted the building information model into the space that the story situates itself in. This is a fantastic experience that you can see on the Oculus Rift or as a 360 video. So it's available for free on Steam, or you can find the video on YouTube. But it is very nice and really a nice focus of the building itself to replace the physical tour that's lost. Next slide. And before I pass it on to Steve to talk about the NAC, the reason why we started with this, with the Parliament buildings, is because of the idea that we should have multiple narratives. We should understand things from multiple truths, from multiple points of views. And I'm going to bring a quote from a TED Talk actually called The Danger of a Single Story by Chimamanda Adichie, which is: the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And so one thing with the Parliament Hill projects is we really try to make sure we're not just looking at it from that one story. We're trying to always provide those new narratives, which brings us to the National Arts Centre project, which continues along the same lens.
Thanks, Katie. The NAC at 50 plus. So the NAC at 50 plus is concerned with the idea of a national historic site. So in Canada, there are two types of designation. One is a national historic site, and then there is a heritage designation. And a national historic site has less restrictions on it than a site that's deemed to be a heritage site. You can alter a national historic site physically, but also the national historic site designation can be a place, but it could also be a person or an event. So it's quite an interesting concept, and this idea has been recently revisited in June 2019. And in this new framework for the history and commemoration for national historic sites in Canada, it calls for a new and expanded historical understanding that will transform the history experience of how stories are communicated at heritage places. Now, what's interesting about that sentence is it, in my opinion, it conflates history and heritage. And it's that conflation that we're looking at in the NAC at 50 plus project. So is a historical understanding how does that inform our understanding of a heritage place? Now, the NEC at 50 Plus has that as a kind of an overall research question. And really, what is that relationship between history and heritage? And I very much appreciate that we're following Mark's presentation on this. And what we're trying to do is to use digital technologies in order to somehow reconcile the idea of valorization that is characteristic of cultural heritage, and here I'm referring to David Lowenthal's characterization with the evidence of history or historiography, and here I'm citing Carlo Ginzburg and his notion of microhistory and relationship between evidence and history, and his argument that if evidence changes, history can change. So our case study to explore this question is the National Arts Centre in Ottawa, Canada. And the National Arts Centre is part of a large program of infrastructure building, cultural infrastructure building that happened in Canada starting in the mid 1960s as part of celebration of Canada's 100th anniversary as a settler colonial state. And the idea, though, for this building program started in 1949, just after the war. And Canada decided that it needed to step up and become its own nation and begin to distance itself from its British roots. So there was a report written in the early 50s called the Massey Report, which gave a kind of state of the art of the arts in Canada. Was quite critical of it, and the National Arts Centre is a product of that era. Now, what we've done to tell the story of the NAC is broken the sort of overarching historical narrative down into three sub narratives. So conception, the idea of the Massey Report, and leading up to the opening of the building, 1949 to 69. The idea of the National Arts Centre as a center, as something that would draw things to it. So again, the idea of embodiment, and then the realization that actually Canada doesn't really work that way. It's just too big, and the idea then of disembodiment, of somehow trying to disperse that center and become a network rather than a center, and that's transformation that happened between 1969, 1999. Of course, these dates are a little bit fluid and a bit arbitrary, but nonetheless. And finally, rejuvenation. So in 1999, the National Arts Centre began a program of transformation, and which culminated in 2019 in the opening of a architectural rehabilitation and addition. The building had always been criticized for being backward facing to the city. It sits in a very prominent location near Parliament Hill that Katie was referring to, but had no access on the street. Rather, it accessed from really what is technically the back of the building. The building had always been criticized for that. But what I want to concentrate on really is the narrative structure and how we are working to really be inclusive and diverse in how the Art Centre is understood. So each of the three sub-narratives that I mentioned, conception, embodiment, disembodiment, rejuvenation, are further broken down into three stories, three characters that tell a story related to that general sub-theme. And you can see what the characterization is in this diagram. Now, I will also say that the framework of this is an open framework. So we can continue to add narratives and stories to flesh out those narratives as the project develops. But that narrative and storytelling component is comprised of two parts. So an interactive storytelling experience, we're calling it. So we are using game engine technology, but it's not really a game. There's no winning and losing. And digital archive. So any of the elements that we use in the interactive story experience can also be accessed through a digital archive that we're constructing in association with the National Arts Centre archivist. And the interactive storytelling is enabled through, again, a building information model that was developed by the architect who did the rehabilitation of the building, and then modified by us and added with some additions by us. And then that building information model is optimized for the Unreal game engine, and I'm making that sound trivial. It is not. And then in the digital archive, we have PDFs, we have photogrammetry of significant assets in the NAC, as well as oral histories that we're recording. There are some people who've been with the organization for over 40 years, for almost the entire life of the institution. So it's very interesting to sort of capture those memories while they're still here. Now this is an image of the main foyer. As you can see, there are some significant works of art. This is an image of the model, by the way, in the Unreal game engine. So the all of the in situ artworks are being captured and displayed in the model, but also they're available through the digital archive for research purposes. Katie's going to talk a little bit more about those. This is one of the theaters. We'll just take you through briefly. Again, this is all of the all in the Unreal game engine, and again, an optimized building information model. And one thing, as Katie pointed out, that we've been trying to do at Sims is to repurpose assets. So a building information model becomes a vehicle for disseminating cultural heritage. So that's something we've worked very hard at continuing to do. Oops. And this is actually a photogrammetric model of a costume. Now, one thing that drove this project early on is the National Arts Centre has a very comprehensive archive, and of the last 50 plus years, and that archive is not open to the public, primarily because they just don't have the space to allow for people to visit. So this will make this archive available to the general public. And again, it's the back end of the experience. The archive is a database that can be accessed without the storytelling experience. And I'm going to turn it back to Katie.
And just as kind of an extension of this project, and maybe part of something to think of. So some of this project has actually been extended into the coursework that I teach in media production design in a class called Basics of Visual Communication, which is a second-year course. And for it, the students pick a visual artwork within the Performing Arts Center to explore. You can see there's 13 that have been identified for them to choose from, and they get to choose the one and tell stories using different digital technologies. And one of the things that's nice about this is that when we look at this project and we think about the previous presentations too, is that we're giving the opportunity and the space and the resources for other people to figure out stories to tell as well. So it's not just the experience being created that tells the stories, it's extensions of that too. So just to kind of show a little bit of what this happens here, next slide. in the first year that happened, and this is the year that it went from an in-person class to a remote class, one of the first groups actually created an audio tour of the experience to talk about how the artwork is connected to the building and has moved around over time. And in this, you can see how their decision to bring in the idea of sound and movement and augmented reality and other social media to really communicate what the artwork was about was quite unique and ingenious in itself. Next slide. And this one that I show here, so this is from last year, and I bring this one in, so it's an Untitled by Gino Lorsini, and it's this painting that, not painting, it's the sculpture that almost blends in into the walls, these almost symmetrical but not symmetrical sculpture. And I bring this in because of something that the archivist from the NAC has said about this project specifically, was that with the students' research, when they started to dive in and they had an interview with the archivist on it, the questions and inquiries that they did actually brought a new perspective of how to look at this artwork, and kind of has changed how the archivist sees it. And so that's kind of the benefit of having more people being able to look at these and examine them and create this content, because it creates these new perspectives. Next slide. And just as one last thing to show, in the first semester from last year, they create these mobile stories or prototypes for stories that you can see very different. These are 3 different artworks, and they're explored in very different ways. One through the idea of the meaning of the artwork, of a journey on the water. One really much more into like the archival history, and another one very much in the style and the colors. And I show these because the more people who tell the stories, the more people who try to share the information, the more we learn. And that's really kind of the thing. We want to hear, we want to understand things from more perspectives. Next slide. And so just to kind of end, and maybe Steve will say add something too, but I like to end on this slide. This is an image from the model that's for the virtual Parliament project, and it's of the Library of Parliament from a top view. And I love this picture because what it is it's a view that you never get in reality, and you never see that floor in reality because it's covered by carpets to protect it. So by us providing new ways of seeing, we get a new understanding of the spaces and of their importance. And I'm going to end it there and see if Steve wants to say something as well.
I think that summed it up nicely. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you so much. You actually provided us some answers to the questions that were posed earlier, like how we reconceptualize the notion of the document, and how we can put it into the official data, so to speak, the new technologies and experimentation. Steve brought the tension between history and heritage that continued very beautifully what Mark was talking about. So I opened the floor for questions, and that comes together. And then there's another question that was posed earlier for Mark. Okay, so should we start with that, then move onwards?
All right, okay.
Mike Turner comment is that it's brilliant. I join. Okay, so we'll start with this question, but then it would be wonderful to go on and to discuss the new media that we've just seen. Mark, in your Marielle Recon asked In your view, is the exclusion eradication of Native Americans to be considered as a cultural genocide? From a philosophical point of view, are the Native Americans' cultures to be viewed as belonging to nature, whereas the
yeah, you're breaking out, so I'll just sort of fell off. Yeah, yes, cultural genocide for sure. You know, I never heard of the King Phillips War until I started this research. And the King Phillips War was just a complete bloody massacres on all sides. So the Pilgrims, like to see themselves as God-fearing people, but when push came to shove, they could chop people up and kill people just as well as anybody else could. So King Philip's War was an incredibly brutal event. And eventually the Native Americans lost, who were sort of the resistance fighters. I mean, today we call them if you've seen Avatar, right? These would be the people that we now sort of value, as the indigenous people fighting back against the colonial oppressor. Well, they didn't make it in the 1670 King Philip's War. So definitely cultural genocide. And as a part, the nature issue, of course, is a complicated one because the Europeans people saw these Native Americans as living in nature, and having no clothes on and things like that, which was, of course, very much not right. And so, but there is a strong connection to nature in Native American culture, but we have to sort of separate those sort of things out. The genocide included a type of battle about what comes out of the soil. So the 150 native species that the Native Americans lived on, including the Jerusalem artichoke, which comes from here in New England, and other plants were exterminated by the English colonialists. So there's no Jerusalem artichoke anywhere here in New England. I have to go to France or I have to go to Italy to get it because it was brought by the English and they loved it and said, thank you very much. We also had a potato that grew here that was, 20 times more protein than the Indian potato and so forth. So there was a whole eradication, not just of the culture, but of their cuisine, and cuisine is very important for people as well.
Yeah, I'll just move on because we are getting short time and the question on the chat because I wanted to maybe move it to Stephen Cathy because the question is about making new histories. You started, Steve, with the idea with Ginsburg quote that when you change the evidence, you change the history. So in the new project, are you looking for that are remaking the way that this art center is perceived as a national monument?
Yes, I mean the official story of the National Arts Center, like most institutions, is relatively smooth. They opened in 1969, and the Prime Minister was there, and they had a big party, and then the NAC, developed as Canada's helped to build Canada's fine arts and performing arts culture, and then they began to reach out, developing, offering educational opportunities to people in remote communities through this expanding digital presence. And now they've rebranded and reopened a much more spacious and inviting building. But in fact, the history of the place is fraught with political turmoil, and the institution has been used as a political instrument by each government, whether it's a left-leaning government or a right-leaning government. So funding has come and gone. There are scandals to deal with sports heroes who seemingly donated large sums of money, but in fact received large rewards in return, and that was discovered, and that financial contribution had to be withdrawn. So all these sub narratives that actually make up the history of the place, and that history is not told in the heritage designation of the place. The heritage designation is all about the brutalist architecture, and how innovative it was, and the quality of the theaters. But in fact, the history is much less grand, much less glorious. Not to mention that it is situated on unceded Algonquin territory, which is only recently acknowledged.
So how would you use, if you can give us a little bit of insight that will get into the making of it, given the example, the amazing example that you've shown on the parliament, how would new technologies would reveal it and would make it into an experiential journey into this new history?
Sorry, Lona, you were breaking up a little bit, but I think the question was, how do the new technologies contribute to this retelling of the history, or a more diverse history?
Yeah, to the way that it's communicated as heritage in an experiential way.
Well, I mean, I have gone as someone who has a love-hate relationship with the whole notion of heritage. At the same time, I understand that it is also an important part of a culture, and it helps to bind a culture together, for better or for worse. So, I mean, is it the role of history to debunk heritage? Or again, is it the role of history to somehow help us to reimagine or reconcile ourselves with our heritage? And again, Mark's work is pointing this out. But at the same time, I mean, do we, Mark, do we get rid of Thanksgiving in the United States?
Yeah, it's never going to happen.
No.
At this time of the year, to ask it.
What would everyone do without Black Friday, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's a subtext, Stephen, and, to your project, and Katie, the question of diversity. In other words, when I came to this project, I was extremely naive about it. I mean, I was, trying to be the good white scholar doing my dutiful thing, And then as I got to talk to the activists and so forth, I slowly was able to sort of understand the need for nuance. So one of the things that they complained about, was the question of diversity, because they say the settler colonial problem is not one of diversity. Diversity comes after the settler colonials arrive and then discover they're diverse. So diversity is like saying, okay, what's the, Russian Jewish shtetl guys who came to Boston, what's their view of Boston? Well, that's a legitimate one because they arrived in the 1880s. Or the Italian-American view of Boston, right? And they arrived in the 1890s and so forth like that. So they have, we have a legitimate work to do in Boston to sort of incorporate our diverse, multi-ethnic world, that developed in the late 19th century. But from the native point of view, all of that is sort of meaningless unless one tackles how they see diversity as the cover because they're just 0.01% of the population. So their ability to enter the diversity conversation is negligible. So they see themselves as disempowered by the diversity, or sort of overwhelmed by the multiple voices. And they're saying our voice, however, is the first voice that has to be heard. And so, and I agree with that. You know, I'm not against diversity in some conditions, but if we really want to unpack the Native American, we have to understand that their critique of diversity is that it overwhelms the traumatic history, which was theirs, and it didn't belong to anybody else. It was unique to them.
Steve or Katie, you seems like you're about to to answer Mark.
No, I concur. I mean, it's, and I told this story to Alona the other day. We have worked with First Nations communities, but I don't usually talk about that work. And one individual who we worked with, the first day we visited the reserve, he called me into his office. He was the chief, and he sat me down and said to me, you know, we get a lot of people coming here, you know, to do research. Ours wasn't a research project. Actually, we were working with the community to develop an asset information model. But he said, I get a lot of people coming in here and doing work on the reserve. And then, you know what? The next week I see them on TV, and they're an expert on Indigenous affairs. So I really took that to heart. And so for example, in the NAC project, one of the stories, perspectives of the stories, is about the Indigenous Theater Company at the NAC. And this has been a real struggle for the community to build this theater department. And ironically, the first play that was put on at the NAC in its opening was a play called The Ecstasy of Rita Joe, which is an Indigenous narrative written by a non-Indigenous person and starring non-Indigenous people, but there were Indigenous people involved, and that was sort of the catalyst for this development of this company. So what we've done is we've approached the company and said, look, this is our platform, and do you want to tell your story about how this community came about? So the project now is that story is their story that we will again enable through the technology. So my point here is that I'm always very cautious about appropriating that story or even understanding it fully, because I haven't been through that trauma, but I've met people who have.
This is getting to be so interesting, and I'm lamenting that our time is about to expire. I would just add a little comment about this exchange and also about what Katie has shown earlier. There is always this kind of catch, because if we're in power, are reluctant to speak in the name of others, and rightly so. I mean, who are we? We didn't suffer the same kind of experience, but we are the only one who have the power to tell the story. Then if we don't tell the story is completely evaporating. So we are always in this dilemma that we can see here where I live in the Middle East very much, because the history of for the Palestinians, therefore there is no history of Palestinians. So it's a question that keeps on hunting us about how to do this. It's a real dilemma, and what Mark said about the of completely of taking our own responsibility as citizens to in the name of the experience as absence may be a way to deal with it. So this is one thing I wanted to say. Mark, I've seen that you have raised your hand, so you'll get the last word. But I also wanted very much to connect what Katie was showing us, especially this wonderful thing about the sculpture that you said that the team has seen it completely differently because of technological visualization, and also the great image that what is with us on the screen was doing with their students. And it seems like this would be, if something comes out of it, there's also kind of a great communication between these two projects, because you seem to have a lot in common and a lot of what to offer, because your technological models were so advanced and impressive. So Mark, do say what you meant to, and we'll be closing up.
Well, I just think what Stephen said was really right, and it gets to the question of, once again, like in my title, the problem of critique. How do we exercise that? I mean, I cannot tell the Native American story, but I can tell the story of the settler colonial, so because that's in some sense not only is available, but it's my obligation, I would sort of say, to understand that story, as opposed to leave it up to the Native American community alone to tell that story, because then it becomes a special interest story of a minor minority that no one is really listening to. So our obligation, I think, as historians and critics and activists, is to sort of amplify the capacity, the diminished capacity of the Native American community to speak for themselves, but also through other types of historical critiques that we can supply as academics.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Mark. And this connects to two notes that Mikey, I think, suggested that we will end up with. Oh, Katie, did you have something?
No, I just see what Remy said about the 3D being something that can reveal something. I guess since now I've taken the floor, I might as well say final words.
Yes, please.
It was two thoughts that came up that over time. One being the idea that I think Alona, you said something about digital technologies telling the story, but I disagree with that idea. I don't think digital technologies are telling the story. I think we as storytellers are using them to tell stories and giving space for stories. And that's, I think, to echo kind of the idea of who's going to tell stories if not. And it's not that we're obligated to give space, be it digital, physical, oral, like however it is, for the stories to be told of others. And so by Mark identifying, hey, there's this story that should be told, or by us making it a mandate to make sure a story is told within the NAC project, that's what we can do, give it space to be told.
That actually really more prepared, or it's a great way to put it, of creating these platforms. And so thank you very much, Katie. And next debates that Mikey is referring to is education and new governance of heritage, sustainable development of communities and territories, and thinking beyond the research of society. That's a fantastic way to open up this discussion to the next phase of the debate. Mikey, is
Thank you, Yael. The connection is not super good, but I think everyone understood it well. We have two events next Monday organized by the same team, Beyond the List, and also one event organized by the team of civil society. This brings us slowly to an end of the team of Beyond the List and a start of the team of civil society. It will be the last team of 2021 debate, and we will end with with a large closing event. More information will be posted on our website, so keep an eye on that. We also have a newsletter, so more information there as well. You can find the subscription link on our website. I think I have said what I wanted to say, and I would also like to thank everyone who attended, and also really for the very, very nice and interesting complimentary presentations today. Thank you. And thank you, Alona and Yael, for organizing all this. It has been really wonderful.
Yes, I would like to also thank very much Yael Forman-Naaman, who is directing our center and was working behind the scene on this project. And I thank you very much. It was fantastic. And we are going to write the report of this. We're happy here today. Thank you very much.